Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Climate, Faith, and Texas. This event is hosted by republicEn and is part of our EcoRight Webinar Series. My name is Wen Lee and I am the Engagement Director at republicEn. I'm thrilled to see so many of you joining us today. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about this important topic with our very special guest. Okay, so just real quick, this is what you should expect today. First, I'm going to give a brief orientation about how to use the webinar platform. Then republicEn's Executive Director, Bob Inglis, will do an introduction for our special guest, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who will give a presentation about climate, faith, and Texas. After that, we'll leave plenty of time for you all to ask Dr. Hayhoe questions. But first, we are going to talk a little bit about who republicEn is. So, are you conservative and concerned about climate change? You're not alone. republicEn is the place for you. We are conservatives talking to conservatives about climate change, and we call our movement the EcoRight. Our community consists of thousands of people across the country, and we most of us are conservative, but many are also libertarian or independent. What we all have in common is the desire to address the serious threat of climate change through the power of free enterprise and to cheer on conservative climate leadership in this country. Okay. So this is an interactive webinar, and this is the Zoom platform, which some of you may be familiar with. So one really neat feature of the Zoom platform is a chat feature. So right now I'm just going to say hi to everyone in the chat box. Okay. So you should see a blinking orange flashing notification near the bottom of your screen, and it says chat. So if you click on that, the chat box should pop up. And here's where you can write comments and submit questions throughout today's event. And if it's in the way, you can drag it around and move it to wherever you want on the screen. So let's just make sure that it's working for everyone. And I see that Henderson has already said hi to everyone. So how about let's all everyone go to the chat box now and type in your name and where you're joining us from. So your city and your state. So type your name and city, state, and we can see where everyone's coming from. Okay, look at all these wonderful people. Okay, I saw Cambridge, Flagstaff, I saw California, Vermont, Chicago, Woodlands, San Antonio. Wonderful. It is very, very exciting to see so many people join today. Thank you very, very much for being here. Okay, so now we all know how to interact with the chat. So feel free throughout today's event to write comments, or if you have questions for Dr. Hayhoe, go ahead and just type in the questions anytime. And our republicEn staff will collect the questions. And at the end, after Dr. Hayhoe is done speaking, we'll go through the questions and get through as many as we can. So feel free to use the chat and interact with one another. Okay, so we're very, very excited about today's speaker. So Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist who has been studying climate science for over 2 decades. She is a professor at Texas Tech University, and she is also the director of the university's Climate Science Center. She has authored over 125 peer-reviewed publications, and she has contributed to many key reports, such as the National Climate Assessment. And together with her husband, who is a pastor, Dr. Hayhoe wrote a book called A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions, which explains the science underlying climate change and how Christian faith can guide opinions and actions on this important issue. So before Dr. Hayhoe speaks, I'm going to hand the mic over to former Congressman and Republicans Executive Director, Bob Inglis, who's going to welcome Dr. Hayhoe. So go ahead, Bob.
Wow, thank you, Wynn, for setting this up, and thank you, Katharine Hayhoe, for joining us. If you follow our social media feed, you know that we are huge fans of Katharine Hayhoe, and so it's really great for us to have her here today on the webinar. You know, I first met Katharine and remember it very well, a climate scientist explaining scripture to a person of the cloth. And it was really interesting to watch as I realized that, oh, Katharine really knows both of these subjects. And somewhat she was saying what seemed to be a news item to the person of the cloth. And so I found it very, I guess I'm just vouching for Katharine as the real deal, the authentic, the genuine article. And so we're very glad to have her here today, and look forward to what she has to say and teach us.
Thank you so much, Bob. Well, it's great to see everybody here. And I notice that a lot of people are not from Texas. That is okay. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be modeling how we talk about this issue no matter where we live, because the important aspect is to bring it down to the local scale. So I'm going to be giving a lot of Texas-specific examples. If you're from a different place, you would want examples from the state that you're from, whether it's California or Massachusetts or Kansas or Illinois. But the basic framework, I think, will hopefully help you figure out how we can have positive, constructive conversations about climate change, no matter where we are, because if we can have them in Texas, we can have them anywhere. All right, I am going to share my screen now here. Here we go. And put it in presentation mode. All right, talking climate change in Texas. When we talk about a changing climate, we often tend to, and a lot of the news media stories we read tend to focus on, do people agree with the science? Or even my personal pet peeve, do people believe in the science? Which means, you know, is it some type of religion that you can choose to believe in or not? When we look at, do people agree that climate is changing due to human activities, which according to natural factors right now, we should actually be getting cooler, not warmer, we can see that across the country, there's a pretty wide range of opinion. Anything that is blue is less than 50% of people would say yes. Anything that's orange is greater than 50%. And the darker the color, the more extreme the number of people in each direction. So here in Texas, this is showing the results by county. Here in Texas, this is what it looks like by congressional district. This data exists for the entire United States as well as Canada. So if you Google Yale public opinion maps, or sorry, Yale climate opinion maps, they'll pop right up and you can get the data for your state, your congressional district, and your county. So I live in the one just below Amarillo. It's a little bit biased here. Lubbock is actually bigger than Amarillo, but it's not showing up on this map, where it is predominantly orange, which means that we've got just over 50% of people who would say they agree that climate is changing due to human activities. And when we hear people talk about climate change, the objections they often throw up are what I would call or characterize as kind of sciencey sounding objections. It's just a natural cycle, or we haven't studied it long enough. You scientists are just making the whole thing up to line your pockets. Or sea levels aren't rising, they're actually falling. It's such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide, how could it affect something as big as our planet? It's just a tiny amount of white powder I put in your glass, why won't you drink it? Or, of course, between the months of November and April, it's cold outside. Now, all of these objections sound sciencey, but when we actually look into them, it turns out they don't have a leg to stand on. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with our Global Weirding series on YouTube. If you aren't, just Google Global Weirding. Actually, you know what? I'm going to type it in right here. If you go to the chat box, www.globalweirdingseries.com, it will take you right there. And we have over 35 short videos that address the common sciencey sounding objections that people have. The bottom line, though, is that if we actually look at the science, the science of understanding how we're affecting our planet is really old. We've understood that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps us over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we should be since Joseph Fourier from the 1820s. Then in the 1850s, two scientists on opposite sides of the Atlantic, John Tyndall in the UK and Eunice Foote, who was an amateur scientist in upstate New York, they both discovered that adding more CO2 to the atmosphere would actually lead to a warmer planet in the 1850s. And then by the 1890s, we knew enough about science so that Arrhenius, who was a Swedish chemist who won the Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry, on the weekends, just for fun, you see what we scientists get up to for fun, just for fun, he decided he was going to calculate the very first climate model by hand, using the science we knew in the 1890s to figure out how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels in the 1890s. And the numbers he got were actually pretty close to what we get today. And then by the 1930s, Guy Callender, who was a British engineer who similarly was looking for something to do on the weekends, he rode around the world, he collected weather station data, and he actually detected the very first observed increase in the temperature of the Earth as a result of burning fossil fuels in the 1930s. The bottom line is that the science of climate change is so basic that it is the same science that explains how refrigerators cool food, how stoves heat food, and how airplanes fly. And there's not a lot of people who would say that airplanes don't fly and stoves don't really heat food, because we'd have to throw all of that science in the toilet if we really truly said, I don't buy it. Well, then you might say, okay, so if the sciencey sounding objections don't have a leg to stand on, what about the religious-y sounding objections? The world's going to end anyways. In fact, climate change might make it happen faster. Or we have dominion over the earth, so that means we can just send it to rack and ruin and do whatever we need to just get out whatever we need for short-term gain. In the Bible, it says there will always be seasons, so how could global warming be real? The one I hear most often is, well, God is in control, not humans. And of course, those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. Now, on that topic, I actually did a talk recently on that specific myth. It turns out in the US, 70% of research scientists are spiritual people who believe in a God or some type of higher power. And of the 30% who would call themselves atheists, 20% of those would actually call themselves spiritual atheists. So that's just a little aside there. If you're interested in more on that, you can go to my website, KatharineHayhoe.com, and look for a talk that I gave to the Upper House in Madison, Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago. But the bottom line, though, is that when we actually look at the Bible, right there in Genesis 1, it says that God made human beings in his image for a reason, so that we could have dominion or be responsible, which is the implication of the word, have dominion, be good stewards, be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. So God gave us responsibility over this planet. And it's as if somebody who you love and care for more than anyone else in the world gave you a piece of property. And you said, well, let me take that piece of property and extract everything of value from it and just leave it a crumbling ruin. What would that say about how you felt about that person? Wouldn't a better expression of your love and respect and care for somebody who gave you this amazing gift be to maintain the property such that it supported crops, you could grow food, you could employ people, you could have natural ecosystems to support the plants and animals in the area, you could sequester carbon in the soil, you could actually turn it into a thriving, growing, profitable place. So when we look again at this map, do you agree with the science? We often get deceived into thinking, well, we just have to get people to agree with the science. But when we start to dig a little deeper, we see that these sciencey and religious-y sounding objections are primarily smoke screens for the real issue. What is the real issue? Well, when we look at the same survey data and we ask a different question, we say, do you think global warming is happening? It turns out just about everybody says yes. It's pretty dark orange across the whole country with just a few exceptions. There's one county in Utah, another in West Virginia, and then there's a little one down there in Georgia. That's it. Do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? It turns out everybody says yes. Do you think that global warming will harm future generations? It's still dark orange. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? You see a little bit more blue there, but it's still mostly orange. Do you think it will harm people in the US? It's still much oranger than do you agree with the science? And then you ask this, do you think it will affect you? This is the first real problem we have, that we don't think it matters to us. Why? Because the number one image or symbol of a changing climate is what? An animal that very few of us have ever seen in real life, sitting on an iceberg up at the poles. Or if we see pictures of people who are being affected by climate change, it's often people who live on islands in the South Pacific with names that sound very strange, like Kiribati and Tuvalu, who live very far away from us. One of the biggest and most dangerous myths that the largest number of people have bought into is the myth that it doesn't matter to me. It is a future issue and a distant issue. The second biggest real myth that we have bought into is this: the solutions are unpleasant. I would have to go vegan, not have any children, stop traveling. We would have to destroy the economy, return to the Stone Age. As Galen Carey from the National Association of Evangelicals said, it's true that in the United States, many people who would call themselves evangelical oppose actions to slow climate change, but they don't do so politically or on a religious basis, but rather politically because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. So the second most dangerous myth we've bought into is that there aren't any solutions to climate change that are not punitive, negative, and harmful. And that is exactly why republicEn is so important, because that's what you guys do. You talk about solutions that are consistent with people's values across the right-hand side of the spectrum. So the problem we have is that our threat-o-meter, so to speak, is unbalanced. We see the impacts as a distant threat that doesn't matter to us personally, and we see the solutions as an imminent threat that would make our lives much worse and much more uncomfortable immediately. Oh yeah, thank you. Somebody says punitive is misspelled. I appreciate that. What do we have to do then in order to have constructive conversations about climate change? We have to recognize that this is the real problem. And the goal of our conversation is to rebalance the threat-o-meter. Talk about why climate impacts matter to us, and talk about what are some solutions that are consistent and compatible with our values. So here's where I want to get Texas specific. And again, this approach can be used anywhere, but I'm going to give specific Texas examples to show you how we can have conversations that rebalance the threat-o-meter. Here we go. So in Texas, actually anywhere, we know that we have normal climate where we have hot and cold and wet and dry. And then if you live in Texas, it looks more like this. Our climate is so extreme that you get whiplash. You can go from below freezing to 70 or 80 degrees in the winter. You can go from 50 to 100 in the summer. We get pretty much everything. We get crazy floods. We get hurricanes, of course. We also get record-breaking droughts. We get wildfires here in Texas, really bad ones actually. And just as an example, last August, 78% of the entire state was in drought. And then the headlines in October, 2 months later, were the wettest fall on record. If that doesn't give you weather whiplash, I don't know what does. Where we live in Lubbock, we actually won the contest 5 years ago for the toughest weather city in the entire United States. But just to keep us humble, we also won a second contest the same year. Most boring city in America. I don't understand that, because if we have crazy weather, there's always something good to talk about. But anyways, if we look at the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage since 1980, Texas is number 1. Why? Because we get everything just about, except maybe mountain floods from snowmelt, because we don't have mountains. Well, we have a few mountains down south, but they don't really get a lot of snow. We also have a lot of people, and we have a lot of infrastructure. Because if it doesn't hit where people live or have infrastructure, you don't get the damages. So people might say, okay, well then in Texas, why would anybody care about climate impacts? Because it's already bad enough. The reason we care about climate impacts is because, first of all, weather and climate extremes already cost us a ton of money, billions of dollars, and climate change is exacerbating or amplifying naturally occurring weather and climate extremes. Specifically, what it's doing, it's sort of like a pair of dice, where you always have a chance of rolling a double 6 naturally. Record-breaking drought, flood, heat wave, hurricane. But decade by decade, climate change is sneaking in and taking one of those other numbers and turning it into a 6. So all of a sudden, we're rolling more and more double 6s, and we're like, how come we're seeing so many double 6s? Why did Houston see 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? That's no longer a 500-year flood event. And then we see a double 7, like Harvey, and we think, where did this come from? How could some places get 50 inches of rain? It's because climate change is supersizing or exacerbating our extremes. Specifically, here are some examples from the National Climate Assessment. If you want more, you can find more at, let me actually tell you, NCA2018.globalchange.gov is the website, and they have a chapter for every region across the US. So you can go to your region and you can see what's happening in your region. We are seeing, first of all, heavy rainfall is getting more frequent because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, there's a lot more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. We're seeing, since the 1950s, we have already seen a huge increase in heavy precipitation across much of the country. The arid Southwest, where they don't get much precipitation, has not seen an increase, but everywhere else has, including our region. This is not the future, this is the past. What's happened from the 1950s up until today. We also see that heat waves are more frequent and cold waves are less frequent, although we still do get cold in the winter. One cold day doesn't mean that the entire planet is not warming over climate timescales. And I was actually really shocked when we were doing the second National Climate Assessment back in 2009, because I made this map of historical number of days over 100 degrees based on historical data. And then we had the summer of 2011. This is how many days over 100 degrees we had in Texas and Oklahoma. Weeks, in some places, a month and a half worth of days over 100 degrees. And this completely shocked me because 2 years before this, I had made a map of what the average summer would look like by the 2040s, which is just 20 years from now. And the average summer, if we continue on our current pathway, look like this. So we care about it because it affects us in the places where we live. What other changes are we seeing? We're seeing that droughts are getting stronger. We've always had droughts, but they're getting stronger the hotter it is because water evaporates out of our soils and our reservoirs and our lakes, contributing to even hotter conditions, which leads to even drier conditions, kind of like this self-reinforcing cycle. We see that forest fires are not more frequent, but they are burning greater and greater area. Across the western US, the US National Climate Assessment concluded that over twice the area has been burned, over 22 million acres has been burned since 1980, whereas without climate change, we would have only seen less than 11 million acres burned. And then, especially pertinent to the Gulf Coast, there's hurricanes. Specifically with hurricanes, we are not seeing more frequent hurricanes. Sometimes we have bad years like 2017, sometimes we have not so bad years like 2018. We aren't seeing a change in the number of hurricanes, but we are seeing that they have a lot more rainfall associated with them. In the case of Harvey, almost 40% more rain than if the same storm had happened 100 years ago. They are intensifying faster because they get their energy from warm ocean water, and the oceans are warming. There's more stronger storms. So we still have the same number of storms, but more of them are stronger. Less of them are the weaker storms. They're moving more slowly so they can sit over us for longer to dump more water on us. They're getting bigger, no surprise, because they're getting their energy from the warm ocean water. And they're also moving northward. So places that didn't used to get that many hurricanes are starting to see more of them. Of course, also sea level is rising, making storm surges worse. So climate change matters in the places where we live. And when we have these conversations, it is really important to have local or regional examples of how climate change is exacerbating or supersizing the wildfires in the West, the floods in the Midwest, sunny day flooding along the eastern coast, stronger hurricanes in the Gulf. Having these examples really brings it home and tackles the first most dangerous myth that we believe, which is that it doesn't matter to us. So what's the second myth again? The second myth is that there aren't solutions. So let me give you some Texas-specific examples that address that myth. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rebalance the threadometer to show that the impacts really do matter to us here and now, but there are climate solutions that are consistent and compatible with our values and our ideology that grow the economy, that create local jobs, that clean up our air and our water, and that help others. So mitigation, what is mitigation? Mitigation is reducing our carbon emissions. Here in Texas, we have more carbon emissions than any other state. I know it looks like we're the same color as California, but if you look at the actual numbers, we're quite a bit higher. We know that Texas also produces more oil than any other state. North Dakota and Texas are the two biggest oil producers in the US, and then California is actually number 3, along with Oklahoma. But here is wind production. Texas is number 1 in wind production. And in fact, when you look at jobs in wind and solar production across Texas, we have over 30,000 jobs within the state in clean energy. When you look at taking us back to that same map, do you agree with the science? When you look at, there's a lot of blue areas and a lot of orange areas, but then you ask people different questions like, do you support funding research into renewable energy? Look at this map. It is dark orange. Yes, Texas is a little lighter orange than the rest of the country, but it's pretty dark. Do you support tax rebates for people who purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels like my husband did for us for Christmas this year? It turns out pretty much, yes, people do. And in fact, when I drive around Lubbock, Texas, I see these little signs now on the side of the road that says, buy solar, rebate ends this year. Do you support, okay, now this is crazy. Do you support putting a tax on fossil fuel companies while equally reducing or refunding the taxes to people, as has been proposed in the bill that was submitted to Congress in November to put a price on carbon? It turns out that most of Texas, and in fact the entire country, is orange. These are the real solutions to climate change, as opposed to destroying the economy and returning to the Stone Age. And people are on board. There's lots of great little facts being added here in the comment section if you want to follow along. In fact, this is an analysis by the University of Texas's Energy Institute looking at the cost of generating electricity today. It turns out that across the entire middle of the country, the cheapest way to generate electricity today is wind. That's green. And then around the edges, including Minnesota and Wisconsin, believe it or not, solar is the second. And then across the rest of the country, the orange is natural gas. If there were a price on carbon, here's how this picture would change. If there were a $50 per ton price on carbon, you see wind spreads across the Midwest, solar spreads across the Southwest and the Southeast, and natural gas is limited to a few small areas in Maine, in the Appalachians, and up in Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. If the price of carbon rose to $100 a ton, the country would look like this. This is how you can use the economy and the free market to drive change. I love talking about what our state is doing. We have, of course, the biggest army base in the United States is in Texas, Fort Hood, and they went with wind and solar energy over natural gas 2 years ago to save taxpayers over $100 million because it was cheaper. I noticed that somebody's on from Georgetown. Georgetown is one of the towns that has gone 100% clean energy. The city of Dallas itself is already carbon neutral for its operations. DFW Airport, Dallas Fort Worth Airport, is the first carbon neutral airport in North America. Now, they don't own the airplanes, okay? And I am very excited about algae and plant-based fuels that people are experimenting with. United Airlines is already running flights out of the LAX airport on biofuels. But there's a lot of stuff going on in every single state that you can find examples of that would surprise people that you can talk about. I love talking about what unexpected actors are doing, like churches or small Christian colleges or big campuses. I like talking about what businesses are doing. The fact that Walmart is the richest company in the world and it aims to generate half of its energy from renewable sources. Apple's number 11, they're already 100%. I like talking about what politicians are doing. The fact that, as we mentioned before, there's a bipartisan Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in Congress. Bipartisan these days is almost like a unicorn. But the fact that you can have bipartisan agreement on the need for climate action, I think, is very encouraging. Then people might say, sure, but what about China? We know that China has horrible air pollution, that its carbon emissions overtook the US a bit less than 10 years ago. But we also know that China is going gangbusters after clean energy. They have more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world. If you look around the world, we know that energy costs of renewables are dropping, even factoring in storage. And in 2017, I don't have the numbers for 2018 yet, but in 2017, 70% of new installed power generation around the world was renewable. In China, as I said, they have more wind and solar than any other country. In the UK, they have the biggest wind farm in the world. In Morocco, they have the biggest solar farm in the world. And I'm most excited about the way that clean energy is making a difference in places that do not have a lot of fossil fuel resources. But they do have a lot of sun and they do have a lot of wind. They don't have a grid. They don't have the money to build big power plants. But they do have microfinancing schemes that allow people to buy their own solar panel, to charge their phones, to run a home business, to keep the lights on for their kids to study so they can go to school. We also have to talk about adaptation solutions. Adaptation solutions here in West Texas often revolve around using water in a smarter way to make sure that as it gets hotter and evaporation increases, we still have the water we need for our agriculture. Water conservation is really important in Texas, and it helps us build resilience to a changing climate again. But there's also other techniques, like in Houston, where the suburb of Clear Lake had already been turning what used to be a municipal golf course into a wetland catchment area. And when Harvey hit, phase 1 was already there, and it soaked up the water like a champ, said Doug Peterson, who's one of the people who worked on it. And phase 1 alone saved 150 homes from inundation. But then lastly, we have to talk about what happens if we don't mitigate and what happens if we don't adapt. And that is the fact that climate change also leads to suffering. And in fact, if we look at those who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of a changing climate, it brings it full circle back to our faith. Because in addition to believing that we are to be stewards or caretakers, to have responsibility over this amazing planet that God gave us, we also believe that we are to love and care for others, especially those less fortunate than us. And when we look at this map of who will suffer the biggest impacts, not will, who is already suffering the biggest impacts of a changing climate, we can see that these people overlap almost exactly with, now keep this geographic pattern in your head, it overlaps almost exactly with where people already live in poverty today. This is a map of where people live in poverty. It overlaps with where people live in hunger today. This is a map of hidden hunger. And it overlaps with where people are dying from exposure to contaminated water. Millions of people per year, most of them under the age of 5, which as a parent absolutely breaks my heart. We care about a changing climate because it affects us in the places where we live, whether we live on the Gulf Coast, where hurricanes are getting stronger, or in India, where heat waves kill thousands of people. Whether we live in Texas or the Midwest or Bangladesh, where floods are getting worse. And in fact, a year ago, last September, during the monsoon season, over a third of the entire country of Bangladesh was underwater. The monsoon is natural and normal. A third of the country being underwater is not. Wildfires affecting us whether we live in Norway or California. Climate change matters to us because it affects us in the places where we live, here in North America, as well as in Syria or Southeast Asia. It affects us through taking things like coastal storms, hurricanes, and exacerbating them or supersizing them, taking our heat waves and making them much more intense. We care about a changing climate, first of all, because it's changing our future conditions that affect our agriculture, our ecosystems, our resources, our health, and the economy. It's taking the risks that we already face in the places where we live, and it's exacerbating them, making them worse, loading the dice against us. But most of all, we care about it because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people, those who have done the least to contribute to this problem in the first place, and that just isn't fair. The bottom line is this: whoever we are, wherever we live, whatever we care about, however we vote, we are already the perfect person to care about climate change. We just have to connect the dots. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was fantastic. Okay, well, now that we let all of that sink in, we have about 20 minutes left. So this is the time for some Q&A for Dr. Hayhoe. So if you haven't already, go ahead, just start typing your questions into the chat box, and Price Atkinson, a Republican staffer, will collect them all, and then we'll get through as many as we can. Okay, but I do have the first question for Dr. Hayhoe, and it comes from Ben in Syracuse, New York. So he asks, he says, when God made his covenant with Noah, he said he would not destroy everything he created by flood again. How do you lovingly answer a brother or sister who's skeptical of climate change because the apocalyptic rhetoric feels like it asserts God is breaking his covenant?
Yes. So interestingly, and I'm going to put this in the chat box, I'm going to put the link right here in the chat box. Interestingly, our Global Weirding episode, What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change, is our most viewed episode. Now, again, this is a PBS series. It's not specifically about religion, faith, Christianity, or anything like that. Everybody has family who asks these questions, or we ask these questions ourselves. So that single episode, which I just put in the chat box above, it's the YouTube link there, addresses a lot of the common kind of biblical sounding objections we have. So in the specific case of God promised he would never flood the earth again, the answer to that is twofold. First of all, number one, we humans are the one who are making the choice to dig up and burn fossil fuels. And God didn't say that you will never flood the earth. He said, I will never flood the earth. But number two, we're not talking about the entire Earth's surface being covered in water. We are talking about the coastlines, which are home to over 300 million people, as well as 2/3 of the world's biggest cities being flooded, and those people having to find different places to live. So the entire Earth is not going to be flooded, but we are going to see key areas flooded where a lot of people live who are going to be displaced and looking for some place to live. Already in Florida, coastal properties have dropped 7% in assessed value compared to their inland neighbors. And that trend is just going to be spreading and continuing across the US and around the world.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question is from Ellie Taylor. She asks, how do we talk to our legislators who reinforce climate change denial?
Well, actually, I think getting Bob's perspective on this would be really helpful. So let me give a short answer, and then Bob, if you don't mind giving an answer too, that would be great. Legislators are a special type of human. And just as we would have conversations with another human, we can have a conversation with our legislators. But here's the thing. Often, what they feel like they have to say publicly to toe the party line may not be what they might say privately in a genuine conversation where somebody's not attacking them, where somebody's not calling them a bad person, but where someone's coming in respectfully and saying, you know, we both care about our region, about our city, about our district. And I'm really concerned about the changes that we're seeing. I'm also excited about the potential for clean energy. Can we talk about something that might have benefits for things that we both care about? That isn't just about climate change, but it's about the economy and jobs and making sure that our systems are more resilient to the increasing impacts that we've seen of crazy weather. Doesn't even matter. You don't even have to call it climate change. What helps is really making sure that we do exactly what we do with anybody. And I talk about this more in my TED Talk, which I posted a link there about. Figure out what somebody already cares about ahead of time. Do your research. Look at what they care about, what they're passionate about. We don't need new values to care about climate change. All we have to do is figure out what values people, and we ourselves, already have, and then connect the dots between those values and a changing climate. So do your research, figure out what makes somebody tick, and rather than just going in there like a bull in a china shop, assuming, well, you should care about this because I care about it, and if you don't care about it, you don't have the right values. Go in there assuming, having done the research, that, hey, they do have the right values, they do care about things that are important to people, and there is a connection between what they already care about and why acting on climate change would be entirely consistent with who they are. And having an organization like republicEn to talk about, having somebody like Bob as an example where you can say, here are Republican solutions to a changing climate that use the free market, is really helpful because it shows people that they don't have to be other than who they are. In fact, they can be exactly who they are and advocate for climate action. Bob.
Yes, Katharine, it's so true. What we've got to do basically is create a constituency of support on the right. That's where it's lacking, because what we're finding is many Republicans in Congress are getting concerned and are really beyond concerned. I mean, they're aware of their lack of an answer publicly and that they need to come up with an answer. But the concern is that their primary voters won't support that. And so what we've got to do is create this constituency on the right that says, yeah, of course, we got a solution to climate change. Free enterprise can solve this, and enter the competition of ideas. And so that's what we do at republicen.org. And we very much need to grow our ranks so that, so like the maps you were showing earlier about the Yale maps, what members of Congress need to see is a whole bunch of Republicans in their districts. And once they see them, then they can venture on what they know to be true, that free enterprise can solve this, if we just get rid of all the subsidies, including the biggest subsidy, which is being able to dump into the trash dump of the sky without paying for the damages we're causing there. And so once Republican members of Congress start seeing that constituency and hearing from them, they'll enter the competition of ideas. But right now, they're afraid that they'd get primaried and tossed out of office because the base isn't with them yet. But we're out to change that with the help of people on this call. And so, yeah, that's it's certainly what our next step is growing that community.
And Bob brings up a really important point, which is the fact that a lot of fossil fuels are subsidized. The numbers are something like what, 160, 170,000 US dollars per second, something like that?
Yeah, it's enormous subsidy really goes into fossil fuels, right?
Yes. And there was a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago, I'll find the link and post it if somebody else hasn't already, that showed that if we had removed fossil fuel subsidies a number of, 5 years ago, how many deaths we would have prevented from air pollution, how much better off the economy would be, how much money we've lost from subsidizing fossil fuels. And there's also another study showed how the gap between the rich and the poor has actually widened over the last 5 years as a result of continued use of fossil fuels. So it really is a human issue. It's an issue that touches not just our heads, but our hearts.
Well said. Okay, switching gears to a question about Texas. Lennon asks about Georgetown. It says that Georgetown has financial issues because of the contract they executed for all renewables, and they're losing money. My conservative friends use that as an excuse to say renewables are a financial problem. Do you have any ideas on a response?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, I'm a scientist, not an economist or a business person. But I would say that that sounds like a business problem, because when we look at the actual levelized cost, and the maps I showed were for levelized costs, wind is cheaper in our region. And again, you know, Fort had made this decision too. And a lot of us are making the decision personally as well through the help of loans. So I think that it's a good opportunity to say, okay, how could we have been smarter? Because this is the way the world is going. Georgetown is a leader. The city of Dallas is already carbon neutral. China is beating the pants off us. I don't know about you, but I'm not okay with that. So what could we do? How could we do this smarter? What lessons have we learned? It isn't the case that renewables are the problem. It's the case that there was some business shortcomings, I think, probably in the negotiations and the planning. And that happens because it's something new. When you're trying something new, you often, you know, trial and error, you learn from your mistakes. So the question is, what can we learn so that we, in this case, the city of Georgetown, generally in our case, the state of Texas, what can we learn such that we continue to be an energy leader in the new century as we have been in the last one?
Right, thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay, D. Bales says, I respect your efforts at reducing unnecessary personal travel. Can you identify the modes of travel you find to be less greenhouse gas emitting per passenger mile? And could you identify what factors you assess or balance in determining whether a trip is appropriate?
Yes. So I use an organization called Climate Stewards. ClimateStewards.org is the website. I use them to offset my travel, and they actually have a carbon calculator where you can type in where you're going, whether you're flying or driving, and how much carbon it produces. There's other carbon calculators like that on the web that you can use to compare different trips. I like them because they're a Christian organization that is nonprofit, that invests the money that I give them to offset my necessary travel after I've reduced what I can, to invest in clean cook stove programs and reforestation in poor countries where people are often dying from indoor air pollution because they don't have access to clean cook stoves. They're cutting down brush and burning dung and burning trees inside, and also often degrading the landscape by taking up all the available biomass to burn instead of allowing it to support wildlife and habitats. So what I do is I've transitioned most of my travel, about 75% of my presentations, to virtual, which is why I love giving webinars like this. And then when I do travel, it's because I have a critical mass. So often it takes quite a bit of time to collect these invitations. If I get an invitation from a location where I don't have that critical mass, my response to them is, I would love to come visit you, but I just don't have the critical mass. You're going to have to wait until we do. And sometimes it takes 2 to 3 years to assemble the critical mass. But when I have it and I go somewhere, in 3 or 4 days, I typically do, you know, anywhere from 4 to 8 public talks, all kinds of workshops, private meetings. I'm going from, 7 a.m. often until 10 p.m. and then I come home and recover for a week afterwards. But my goal is to make every single trip that I do worth it from a perspective of, and in fact, one time I calculated for a trip I went to DC, which is quite a ways from Texas, I calculated that the average carbon footprint of each event that I did on that trip was equivalent to if I had lived out in the suburbs and driven in and back for each event separately. That was the carbon footprint of flying to DC to do each event. So that's my goal, because looking at each other eye to eye and face to face actually is very important. We can do a lot through video, but sometimes that personal exchange can really make a difference in a way that virtual can't. But at the same time, we've done experiments, and we've actually published them, where people went to a real live talk from me, or they watched a video of the real live talk, and it had an equal impact on the change in their opinion about, is climate change real? Does it matter to me as a Christian? Should I care about it? So video does a lot, and I invest, as you can see, in things like, a screen, audio equipment, camera. I have these like sound absorbers that you can't see just off the screen that kind of look like, actually I can show you one. Looks like this to make it sound better. But relating and connecting to each other as humans is still really important, because in this current political public atmosphere, we're just being driven apart. People are just emphasizing what divides us again and again. And really what unites us is so much more than what divides us. We are humans. We live on this planet. We breathe the same air. We drink water. We eat food. We want a safe place to live. We want a healthy economy where we can get a job and support our families. We really do want the same things. And so connecting to each other as humans is really important, because that is what helps us, first of all, gives us hope through connecting to other people who have the same values and the same concerns. You can share hopeful stories. And it also shows us why we care. So that's why the most important thing we can do about a changing climate is talk about it and join an organization like republicEn that shares our values, that amplifies our voice, that helps us reach out to our decision makers and our leaders to say, we want change because of who we are. It isn't a case of becoming a bunch of liberal tree huggers. Although if we are a liberal tree hugger, we do care about climate change typically. It's a case of being exactly who we are, and because of that, being the perfect person to care about a changing climate.
Okay, let's see. Someone asked about recently you responded to the Trump administration's recent plan to let's see. Let me see. You said there were 3 incorrect statements and 9 words. And wondering if you can discuss that if there's time. Do you understand what they're asking about? I think it was a recent tweet that you tweeted responding to critiques of the National Climate Assessment.
Okay, what I'm going to do is, for people who don't know what we're talking about here, I'm actually talking about a recent Facebook post and a thread on Twitter about the most recent comments by people from the EPA and the USGS about the National Climate Assessment process and about climate projections in general. So if you don't already follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, please do, because that's where you'll find this. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to post right here. Let's see. Here we go. In the chat box, I'm going to post the post that the question's about. So if you click on that post, that should take you there. I know it looks a bit wonky, but if you click on it, I'm trying it out right now, it should take you to the post that we're talking about. So this was a New York Times article where they had interviewed the director of USGS as well as a spokesperson for the EPA, and they had said some things that were, first of all, troubling, and second of all, not true. They said that in the future, they don't want the National Climate Assessment to use any information past 2040, which means that the impacts of the choices we make today would not be evident in the information that was being used to make decisions today, which I think is just incredibly short-sighted, because to make the best possible decision, you need the best possible information. And if you're automatically just truncating the information you use, you're not making a decision based on the full set of facts, which means you're going to be making a flawed decision. So it just doesn't make sense to do that. But then the reason they use to justify cutting off the information they use to just the next 20 years in the National Climate Assessment, which is supposed to inform federal decision-making on climate change, the reason they used is because they said those climate models aren't reliable and they only use the most extreme scenario. The problems with that statement are the following. First of all, the biggest uncertainty in future projections is not climate models, it's us. Not US, but us. It's the decisions that we make personally. So how much carbon we use, whether we continue to depend on fossil fuels, whether we transition gradually off fossil fuels, or whether we take a sharp nosedive to carbon neutral, those decisions are the biggest uncertainty in the future. So when they say, well, they're too uncertain to use, it's because, yes, that's the point. The point of the projections is to show a wide range of what will happen depending on the choices we make, such that we can make the best possible decision today to avoid the worst of the impacts. That's the point. Second of all, they said the National Climate Assessment only shows the most extreme scenario, and that, frankly, is absolutely false. If you take the time to look at the National Climate Assessment, and I provided the link earlier, it's nca2018.globalchange.gov, you will see that no matter whether they're talking about sea level rise in Florida, bigger and stronger atmospheric rivers in California, snowpack melt, wildfires, flooding in the Midwest, no matter what they're talking about, we always give the range from a very low scenario to a continued dependence on fossil fuels scenario, because we need that information to make the right decision. So when the administration is actually making statements that are not just unsound in terms of saying we don't want to use facts to make our decisions, but they're actually saying things that aren't not true, that is very, very concerning. And actually, Bob, I would love for your comment on this situation.
Yeah, I hope that you can hear me now. I was muted there for a second. I think you've taught me, Catherine, and other climate scientists have taught me really that that it simply is not true that the estimates overstate the impact or take the most extreme possibilities, because really we could end up understating some of these things, and the result could be far greater risk than we are contemplating. And so that's the thing that I think is important to keep in mind is, this isn't apocalyptic, but it is a serious risk that we're facing. So what do you do in the face of risk? Do you proceed pell-mell in the face of it? That seems pretty liberal to me. If you're conservative in personality as well as in politics, seems to me what you want to do is you want to be aware of the risk and then move to reduce them. It's a strange thing that's happened here, is that people that proclaim that they're conservative are really just protecting existing interest, and they're not responding to the obvious risk signals that are out there that the scientists are telling us about, and that people that really know markets and financial kind of arrangements would tell us that, yeah, you want to be aware of those risks and move against them. Otherwise, you could get caught way out there on the limb. And so that's where it's important just to debunk these things, and appreciate your posts there.
Okay, we have time to squeeze in one last question for Dr. Hayhoe. You live in a conservative area. How do audiences respond to your climate education talks in your area?
Okay, great question. So I live in, last time they surveyed cities, it turned out that Provo, Utah was the most politically conservative city in the country, and Lubbock, Texas was number 2. And in my TED Talk, I won't tell you the story because you need to watch the TED Talk if you haven't. I put a link here. In my TED Talk, I actually tell a story about how I ran into this the first time I actually taught a class on campus. So check out my TED Talk. It starts with a story of the very first time I ever taught a class. And it wasn't a class on climate change. It was a class on the geologic carbon cycle at Texas Tech. What I find, though, is that when we can actually have a conversation, so if I can go in and talk to the Rotary Club or a local women's group or the Senior Citizens Home or Second Baptist Church, if we can have a conversation where I begin the conversation with what we share, what we value, what we have in common, and then I connect the dots to why that matters to the impacts of a changing climate in the places where I live. And then I talk about solutions. And at the Lubbock Women's Club, which is a place I spoke to just recently, a couple of months ago, I loved it because at the end of doing this, very much with a focus on our area, this older woman came up to me who was a local landowner, a farmer and a producer. And she came up to me and she said, "That was great." She said, "They're installing wind turbines on our neighbor's land. I'm going to take out my stool and my sandwiches and I'm going to watch what they do because maybe I should put some on my land too because they make money, don't they?" I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what they do. So we can have conversations when we can actually connect. But unfortunately, a lot of times today, people do not want to connect. They do not want to have conversations with people that they're afraid, and fear is a really important word there, but they're afraid might say something that might challenge who they are and what they believe. So often our exchanges are more like this than like this. And a lot of these types of exchanges happen on social media where we're not looking at each other eye to eye. I have gotten some of the most horrendous attacks from local radio personalities here in Lubbock, Texas, where they just, up and unprovoked call me the most awful names. And when I actually reply to them and I say, "I would like to sit down and have coffee with you. Would you be willing to meet me? I'm free the next couple of days. Here's the times I'm free. Let's bring along somebody who we both know, like one of our local broadcast meteorologists who they might know, but I know that he's a good friend too. We could bring along Ron, or, we could meet ourselves. Let's sit down and talk about this." You know what happens? Nothing. They have no interest in actually having a conversation. So on social media, it's really hard to have positive conversations. I certainly try, but if there is no mutual respect, if there is no willingness to listen, then you're just going like this and wasting your time. That's why the personal connection is so important. And when we have the personal connection, I can tell you that on social media, on average, I would say, I get between 5 to 10 people a day now saying really nasty things to me. 5 to 10 a day. In person, in Texas, when I've actually like talked to somebody face to face in person, I only need one hand to count the number of negative experiences and exchanges I've had in person. One hand in 10 years. Now, there's been a lot of positive ones, a lot of neutral ones, but it really does matter. We can have positive conversations, but we can only do so when we begin with what we agree on rather than what we disagree on. And when we're having those conversations in a mutually respectful and a personal way. And often social media is just not the place to have those conversations. Once in a while it works. I don't want to say it doesn't, but most of the time it doesn't. So social media, and if you want more, you can follow me on Facebook and on Twitter, and you can subscribe to our Global Weirding series on YouTube. On social media, my goal is to provide the information that we need to have conversations with people who we know.
Lovely. That was a great way to end this, Katharine. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise. You're just a real inspiration, and it's wonderful that you're here talking to us. This is great. Okay, before everyone leaves, I just want to quickly, so Katharine, if you can, yes, there we go. I was going to say, put in the chat all the places to follow you, and on Twitter and on Facebook, and make sure you watch her videos as well. And I'm just going to very quickly share my screen with you so people can see more resources that they can tap into at republicEn.org, our website. If you go to our website on our homepage, we actually have a section that says Learn, and we have a pretty new climate science page that I encourage everyone to check out. So if you go to Learn, Climate Science, it's a very broad and accessible overview about climate science and the consensus of what's happening. And if you have friends who are not clear on the science or they question what's happening, we recommend that you send them here. It's very clear, it's short, and it's, I think this is a great place to start. In addition, if you are totally ready to take action and you want to do something about this, we invite you to join our community, and there is on our website an ACT section. So if you go to ACT, because it's time to take action, you can go to our Action Center, and we have several tailored campaigns for conservatives to speak up to their members of Congress, and whether it's signing a petition or it's writing a letter to tell your congressperson that I'm a conservative and I care about climate change. There's lots of ways for you to take action. So I recommend that you check that out as well. Okay. And then lastly, I want to say that you're all going to receive a survey in your email later today, so you can tell us what you thought of today's webinar and give feedback. And that's it. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you to Dr. Hayhoe for your time and your wisdom and expertise. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.